Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you're watching these videos, you're either in my class or you stumble across them on the internet. Please learn the information the way your instructor wants you to learn it. I'm covering the information the way that I want my students to learn it for now. So, if you're in my class, you should be following along on your list of things to know or your laboratory guide. We're going to be on page 5. We're going to be talking about the planes and sections on the bottom of page 5 and carrying on to page 6. I have a couple of models here to help me demonstrate how we might ask questions about that in the laboratory. Now, if you want to, what I would highly recommend is you take your lab manual and you follow along in the lab manual. We'll be on page 15, 16, and 17 talking about planes and sections and body cavities. Okay? So now, what are these planes and sections of which I speak? Well, when we look inside the human body, we have to section it. We have to cut it in sections, or they say dissect. To dissect means to cut into two. When we dissect something, it might look different from different angles. So, when we dissect, when you send a sample to a lab, you need to tell the other physician or other healthcare professional, by the way, this is a section of this organ. Or when you're looking at something from a different view, you might say, this is a section of this organ from this view. For example, this model shows us a model of the human brain. Okay? If I cut the brain this way, what would be called a sagittal section, then I would be cutting a piece off and I could be looking inside of it and seeing certain structures. If I cut the brain in what's called a transverse section, then I would be removing that and I would be looking at it from a superior view. And you would have to know anterior and posterior. We're going to start putting all these terms together eventually. So it's important to know the planes and sections so you know what you're looking at, what angle or how something's been cut. As you can see from the brain, it looks drastically differently from a sagittal section than it does from a transverse section and what you would see. Okay? So I'm going to run through these planes and sections. Now, the first one I want to talk about is called the sagittal section. Sagittal means to divide the human body or divide something into right and left portions. In lecture, I'll ask you a verbal definition, and it will be that verbal definition. Sagittal means to divide something into right and left portions. Now, there are two qualifiers for sagittal. If we cut perfectly down the midline like this or like this, we would call that a mid-sagittal section because it's perfectly on the midline. So cutting the human body this way, in this particular plane of space, or in this section, that would be called a mid-sagittal section. You could simply say sagittal, and that's correct also. If I were to start to cut it off to the side somewhere, then we would call that a parasagittal section. It means it's parallel to the midline. So you're cutting the body in a vertical plane, and you're cutting it into right and left portions. If you divide the body into equal right and left portions, then it's said to be a mid-sagittal section. If you divide the body into unequal right and left portions, if I could cut right here, this side would be larger than this side, then I have a parasagittal section. Okay? So make sure you know those definitions. Mid-sagittal is a section through the body that divides it into equal right and left portions. Parasagittal is a section through the body that divides it into unequal left and right portions. In lab, I'll simply have a piece of paper or a card or something, and it'll say, identify the plane or section, and you would have to say mid-sagittal or sagittal. Or identify the plane or section. Got it? Now, another type of vertical section would be called a frontal or coronal section. Typically, we use coronal when we're talking about a frontal section of the head, but you can say frontal or coronal. When we do a frontal section or a coronal section, that is a section through the body. It's a vertical section through the body that divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. So, if I cut the breastplate off of this model and I cut in this plane, I have cut the body into a frontal or coronal section. Okay? Again, frontal or coronal section is a section that divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. That would be a lecture definition. For lab, I would simply say identify the plane or section, and you would have to say frontal or coronal. Now, A transverse section is a horizontal section. In a transverse section, you would be cutting across the body. So if I ask you to identify this planar section right here, this would be a transverse section cutting across the body. Technically, you would have to say a section through the body that is perpendicular to the vertical plane or parallel to the horizon. There's some qualifiers, but technically the definition would be any section that divides the body into superior and inferior portions. A transverse section is a section through the body parallel to the horizon or perpendicular to the vertical plane that divides the body into superior and inferior portions. This would be a transverse section. If I cut this brain this way, that would be a transverse section through the brain. Transverse means across. And again, remember, we're always in correct anatomical position when we dissect. So if I ask you what this planar section is, it is not parasagittal because the arm is cut first and then moved. So that was a transverse section and then they moved the arm. So please don't confuse that for parasagittal. Okay? So now, we've gone through sagittal, transverse, parasagittal, frontal, or coronal. Forgive me for a second. My hands are dry. And we've covered all of the planes and sections of the body. Now, I'm going to continue in the list of things to know, and I'm going to go over the body cavities. And this is important. And there are pictures on page 17, and it's all discussed in your lab manual. Our body has empty chambers in it called the body cavities. There are two major body cavities in the human body. One of them lies a little more posterior and is called the dorsal body cavity, since dorsal is posterior. And the other one lies a little bit more anterior and is called the ventral body cavity. Now here you can see the entire ventral body cavity. Once we cut the body open and remove the guts or the viscera, you can see all of this empty space would be called the ventral body cavity. If I turn this model sideways, you can begin to see part of the dorsal body cavity, and I'm going to turn them a little bit further back. All of this light blue area here would be where the dorsal body cavity runs. The dorsal body cavity is divided into two subcavities. The one where your brain lives is called the cranial cavity. Cranial means brain case, so this is the cranial cavity. This cavity that extends down here where the spinal cord lives is called the spinal cavity. So if I asked you to ID this space on a lab test, you'd simply say cranial cavity. If I asked you to identify this space down here, I hope you can see that on the camera, that would be the spinal cavity. If I ask you for both together, you would say dorsal body cavity. Make sense? Now the ventral body cavity is divided into two subcavities. The diaphragm is this muscle that arches across here. It's a big dome-shaped or arching muscle, and it separates this space from all of this space. This area is known as the thoracic cavity. It's in the thorax. It makes sense. And then all of this space is known as the abdominopelvic cavity because it includes the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Because there's no real barrier here like there is for the diaphragm, this is all one space called the abdominopelvic cavity. But in order to make more questions for an anatomy test, not really, but because these are actually somewhat separate areas, if I ask you to identify just this space here, this would be the abdominal cavity. And if I ask you to identify just this space down here, it would be called the pelvic cavity. Typically what we do is put a piece of tape across the certain spaces or all of them. If I ask you for this entire area, ventral body cavity. This area alone would be thoracic. This area here would be abdominal, and this area would be the pelvic cavity. So I need you guys to practice all of these cavities. Dorsal with cranial and spinal, ventral with thoracic and abdominopelvic. Or individually, this would be the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Do all of this till you can't stand it, do it till you understand it, and then do it some more until you can teach it to someone without looking at your notes. Practice, practice, practice. Do it as often as you can so that you learn this material backwards and forwards, because there's going to be a lot of material on this first round of exams for lecture and lab, and you need to know all of this, okay? I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope you learned something. I hope to see you on the flip side in the next lecture. Thanks.